understanding the psychological impact of the global pandemic through a non-diagnostic lens using the Power Threat Meaning Framework. Back in March 2020, we all suddenly found ourselves in uncharted territory as the UK government took the unprecedented decision to place the country in lockdown in response to the rising COVID-19 cases. At the beginning of the first lockdown, life suddenly changed for everyone in the UK as it had for people in other countries in the preceding months. A stay-at-home order limited all social contact and many services were abruptly halted or severely restricted, preventing staff reaching those they were supporting or caring for until changes to working practice were arranged that enabled some services to be safely reinstated. For many, the return to work presented real ethical dilemmas about the dangers they would be faced within their line of duty and the risks posed to them and their families. The media has since been saturated with warnings of an impending mental health crisis as a consequence of the COVID-19 crisis on an almost daily basis. Dramatic headlines warned of a mental health tsunami and more lately suggest a wave of mental health problems as a result of the pandemic and continued lockdowns and restrictions. Much of what is reported in the media implies that the psychological impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and consequential emotional distress is giving rise to a second pandemic of mental health disorders. These attention-grabbing headlines that are designed to pull readers in can be overwhelming and compound fears of the psychological and emotional impact of the pandemic. One clinical research project by Taylor et al. 2020 suggests that during a pandemic, people exhibit stress responses and subsequently developed a COVID stress scale, CSS, in order to measure COVID stress syndrome. The CSS measures fear and anxiety-related responses, such as fear of becoming infected, fear of coming into contact with objects or surfaces that might be contaminated, disease-related xenophobia, fear of socio-economic consequences, compulsive checking and reassurance seeking, and traumatic stress symptoms such as nightmares and intrusive thoughts and so on. If you've experienced any of those over the last year, you're in good company with so many others experiencing similar stresses, which is seemingly validated by this clinical measurement. However, I would encourage you to hold on to that thought, because whilst on the face of it, some studies appear to provide an empirically sound tool for measuring distress associated with COVID, which may identify when someone might benefit from professional support, there are alternative ways of understanding the psychological and emotional responses to the current crisis. Whilst it's true that the lives of everyone have been impacted by the pandemic globally, and that a great number of people are suffering grief, loss, extreme worry and distress, it is unhelpful to apply medicalised explanations because this persuades people that they are mentally ill. Although media publicity looks as if it is raising awareness of the psychological impact of the pandemic on a superficial level, the truth behind the headlines is that the narrative being promoted inadvertently confuses normal human responses with an outdated medical model of mental health that is no longer in line with current thinking and practice. In medicalised terms, the thinking goes something like this. How do we know a person is mentally ill? Because they obsessively fear contamination. Why do they fear contamination? Because they are mentally ill. These circular arguments are not an explanation of why a person has those experiences, nor an explanation of the root cause of their distress. This dominant discourse operates within a power imbalance, since it disempowers the individual through denial of context, failing to account for the situation or circumstance. Diagnostic understandings sever links with social contexts and relationships, overlooking the harmful impact of economic and social policies and negative life experiences, focusing instead on what might be wrong with our brains and bodies. This is nothing more than a pseudo explanation, but one which carries immense power. More concerningly, this expression of someone's subjective opinion often has life-changing consequences for the individual it is being applied to. Although some people find diagnostic interpretations helpful, since it is often the currency to accessing particular services or support, for others, receiving a diagnosis creates more harm and feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, and the pathologizing label often creates the barrier to exclusion from services, limiting the possibility of change. As Professor Peter Kinderman highlights, once a particular mental illness is diagnosed, people's life experiences and their views on the origins of their difficulties are then deemed irrelevant by professionals with huge privilege, power, and influence. Additionally, the medical way of thinking places a huge burden of responsibility for the distress firmly on the shoulders of mental health professionals, doctors, and psychiatrists. Yes, all citizens have a responsibility, however small, to create a society that supports those experiencing distress and provide one which provides alternative solutions that enable people to take back control of their lives through more hopeful narratives. Similarly, for those whose work involves higher risk of infection, the frequency of hand washing may have increased due to intensification of infection prevention procedures. And for those who now wash their hands several times per day, or wash down door handles or disinfect grocery packaging, these are not signs of obsessive compulsive disorder. In the context of a pandemic, contamination has become a prominent source of fear, and we are constantly reminded of ways to avoid contamination by wearing face masks, avoiding standing too close to other people, washing our hands, cleaning surfaces, and so on. Reducing contact with others and minimizing the risk of contamination have now become the new social norms, and these are survival mechanisms for us all. Likewise, those who are afraid to leave their homes for fear of contracting a fatal disease should not be labelled as being socially anxious nor agoraphobic. All these are behaviours of responsible citizens doing what they can to not only prevent the transmission of the virus, but to also adapt to survive a very real threat to life. Whilst I appreciate that not everyone has the security of isolating or shielding, but along with countless others who feel unsafe in their physical environment, I have isolated at home for over a year and have not visited retail premises nor public building, nor even the homes of my own family since the first lockdown in March 2020. Even though this makes me deeply unhappy, extremely lonely, and even tearful at times, it is important to note that these are not signs of mental illness, but understandable responses to the unrelenting stress, worry, and abrupt disruption to secure relationships, the loss of important attachments, and lack of safe social contact. Like millions of others, I'm struggling with the contention of unmet core needs, threats to physical safety, survival, and adhering to legal powers that require everyone to minimise contact with other people in order to reduce the transmission of COVID in order to protect lives. To quote the formidable Dr. Lucy Johnstone, who argues that the predictions of widespread mental health crisis makes no sense since our reactions are understandable in the current context, and furthermore that the individualisation and medicalisation of normal human reactions disconnects us from our feelings and from the appropriate solutions. Yet this is an opportunity to challenge this pervasive medicalised way of thinking, thereby putting us in a position to create a fairer society that is better for everyone's emotional well-being. For many years, both Dr. Lucy Johnstone and Professor Mary Boyle have robustly evidenced their assertions that the things that are considered symptoms of mental illnesses are actually unusual ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And whilst these may be distressing to others and the person themselves, they are understandable when viewed in the context of a person's life experiences, the culture and social norms we are expected to live up to, and the degree to which we are exposed to trauma, abuse, injustice, and inequality. With this in mind, along with a working party of colleagues, Lucy and Mary pioneered the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is a radical new approach to understanding distress and provides a tool with which to create new, more hopeful narratives, whilst helping to find ways forward as individuals, families, social groups, and whole societies. The framework has recently been published as a book. A straight-talking introduction to the PTMF is available to purchase from PCCS Books website. I recommend obtaining a copy, especially if you are interested in not only utilising the framework for personal use, but also for professional purposes. And to quote Professor Mary Boyle, that moving beyond the DSM mindset is about truly moving away from medicalisation, moving well away from a false assumption that models designed for understanding bodies that work well in general medicine can be applied to people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviour. The PTMF is a fundamentally different approach. It is a new perspective on why people sometimes experience a whole range of forms of distress, confusion, fear, despair, and troubled or troubling behaviour. This non-diagnostic approach to patterns of distress and unusual experiences understands people in the context of their social and relational environments, and the framework views the individual as making meaning within their life circumstances. The framework is summarised in these core questions, which not only demedicalise distress, but also promotes a very different way of thinking. And these are the core questions. What is or has happened to you, or how is power operating in your life? How did it affect you? So what kinds of threats does this pose? What sense did you make of it? The framework is summarised in these core questions, which not only demedicalise distress, but also promote a very different way of thinking. What has happened to you, or how is power operating in your life? How did it affect you, or what kinds of threats does this pose? It is also an opportunity to look at what meaning is being developed, so what sense a person is making of their experiences. And importantly, what they are having to do to survive and the types of responses they might be using. So rather than concentrating on a diagnostic framework that sees threat responses as symptoms of an illness or disorder, the framework considers what threat responses a person is using or what they are doing in order to survive the circumstances they find themselves in. For example, a person may be completely avoiding other people, while some may need constant reassurance from others. Some individuals may repeatedly check the news in comparison to others who may avoid the news. Likewise, some may frequently wash or clean, and so on. The PTMF can be used in any setting, from one-to-one clinical environments to peer support or self-help work. This then leads to the questions: what are your strengths, or what access to power resources do you have? And to integrate all of those, what is your story? So the framework is not just a clinical tool, it is helpful to everyone. Power is a central aspect of our lives in both the negative and positive sense, and its operation can make it appear that some people deserve power and privilege above others. Although there is no single definition of power, since this refers to a complex set of processes which operate below our awareness, often without conscious intention, here are a few suggested definitions. Being able to obtain security and advantages for yourself or others. Being able to influence your environment to meet your own needs and interests. Controlling resources that other people may want and need or fear. The PTMF sees power inequalities as central to understanding emotional and psychological distress and being able to offer constructive help. Power is also a key factor in linking these difficulties to wider social processes and highlighting the need for social action and social justice. This very different way of thinking encourages us to consider the operation of power, which is everywhere in our lives, sometimes in obvious ways and sometimes in less obvious ways. In spite of this, neither diagnosis nor most therapies place enough emphasis on power as defined in the PTMF. Instead, we too often see the problem as being in the individual, their mental illness or personality disorder, their negative cognitions, or their lack of resilience, and so on. Nevertheless, the PTMF puts power first and foremost, and all the other parts of the narrative flow from that. The PTMF sees many threats as arising from the negative operation of power, which is why the list of core threats partly maps onto the list of different forms of power. However, different forms of power and the threats they give rise to are so interrelated that it is not possible to say that a particular form of power gives rise to a particular threat. All threats to core needs are common in contexts of inequality and other sorts of deprivation, discrimination, exclusion, marginalisation, and social injustice. What reduces threat for some people can increase them for others. In other words, some people or groups can meet their core needs in ways that are damaging to others. These damaging practices can be embedded in organisations or social institutions, including the family. The potential for damage can be hidden by ideological power. That is the power over how we talk about and make sense of ourselves and the world. Welfare policies that create multiple threats for many people are justified by language such as encouraging people into work and calling people scroungers. Welfare systems routinely create economic threats through sanctions or maladministration. They can also create threats to identity by making people reveal a great deal of negative information about themselves and their circumstances. Mental health systems threaten people's ability to develop their own values and make meaning of their experiences by imposing a medicalised explanation of their problem. This may lead to threats to the body through psychiatric drugs and other physical interventions such as ECT. We cannot understand any aspect of power, threat, or threat response separately from their meanings. Meanings arise from many sources, but are shaped by wider social understandings about what it means to be mentally ill, a good nurse or a good mother, have a happy family, be a refugee, and so on. Ideological meanings, which are deeply embedded assumptions about the world that serve certain interests, often those of people who are already more powerful and privileged, and neoliberalism is a good example. However, we can only understand the sense or meanings a person is making from the individual themselves. Anything else is just a best guess. Threat responses are the ways we have learned as human beings to cope with real or perceived threats, what we do to overcome, escape, or rebalance power deficits. Our threat responses can be physical, mental, social, or spiritual. They can affect every aspect of our lives. These are not symptoms of a particular mental disorder. They are necessary and creative strategies that we all use at times for protection and survival. We have all evolved to respond to threats in similar ways, and we all share some of the more instinctive bodily reactions such as fight, flight, or freeze response. However, threat responses range across a continuum. Some are under a great degree of control, even if they are not always easy to stop. For example, substance misuse, self-harm, or avoiding going out, which we are all being asked to do globally right now. And then it could also be carrying out rituals and so on. Our threat responses depend partly on what options we have. Some practices obscure the link between threat and threat response by individualising the problem, but the framework enables us to restore those links. Psychiatric practice and some psychological or psychotherapeutic practice obscure the link between threats and threat responses by placing the source of the problem within the individual, with the message that they should be coping better and may need mental health support. At one level, this is common sense because we know that people struggling financially or looking after young children have found the pandemic much harder. But at the same time, we tend to describe this as a mental health problem, rather than a completely understandable response to the stresses they are under. The Power Threat Meaning Framework shows how we can restore the links between threats and threat responses. Stories and narratives lie at the heart of the PTMF, and the simple answer to what we need to do rather than diagnose or apply harmful labels is to listen to people's narratives. Developing a narrative is not always easy, nor does it instantly solve a person's difficulties. However, developing a different, more hopeful narrative can be a healing process. The framework encourages us to take back authorship of our narratives, to tell our stories and make our voices heard. As Dr. Jackie Dillon, survivor and campaigner, stated, rather than asking what's wrong with you, we need to ask what happened to you, because personal stories and narratives need to be heard. Now we'll move on to hearing a little bit of a case study. This is not a real life story. This is just something that's been developed for this presentation. Astrid is a nurse in her mid-30s who lives with her daughter Imogen and partner Jane. Astrid is very family orientated, and before the COVID crisis, they often did activities together that included their extended families. In her free time, Astrid is also a talented artist who loves to paint countryside scenes. Astrid had a materially privileged upbringing. Her parents were both health professionals who inspired her nursing career and taught her the values of being a hardworking and dedicated professional. Just before the first lockdown, Astrid advised her now retired parents to quarantine themselves as she became increasingly worried for their well-being. Although Astrid maintains regular contact with her parents via video calls, she is concerned about her parents being lonely and isolated, as she has been unable to visit since last year because they are deemed clinically vulnerable and shielding from social contact. Astrid has harboured an intense fear of masks since her late teenage years and is having nightmares and flashbacks to when she was raped by someone at a masquerade ball, which left her traumatised. Although she is starting to adjust to the plain face masks at work, she always asks her partner to do the grocery shopping, stating that it's to reduce the risk of transmitting COVID, when in reality, it is well-rehearsed avoidance to avert the intense fear of the array of patterned masks worn by the public, which send her into a panic-stricken frenzy where she feels overwhelmed with a sudden urge to escape. Since last year, Astrid has been redeployed to cover in other areas of the hospital, and whilst she is always working as part of a supportive team, she feels isolated from the colleagues she has worked alongside for many years and developed close friendships with. Astrid has been troubled by financial concerns since Jane lost her job due to the pandemic. To mitigate some of that stress, Astrid often works extra hours, staying longer on shift whenever she is needed, despite the constant risk of contracting a deadly virus. This has attracted a great deal of criticism from Jane, whose view is that Astrid is putting herself at increased risk of burnout and neglecting their relationship. This also causes additional strain on her relationship with Imogen, who she rarely sees lately, since Imogen is legally required to attend school. This concerns Astrid as she feels powerless to prevent Imogen's increasing social exposure to the possibility of contracting COVID. Before the pandemic, Astrid was described as an energetic, sociable and friendly person. However, over the last few months, Astrid has been feeling stressed, on edge and unable to relax, even though, by her own admission, she is worn out. Now exhausted and even a little weepy at times, Astrid also feels guilty for what she perceives as a lack of resilience and is reluctant to discuss these difficulties with a GP because she is uneasy with being unable to live up to others' expectations and of appearing unable to cope with the demands of the job. Additionally, Astrid is keen not to add to the stress of other professionals whom she is aware are also under a great deal of pressure. Astrid's struggles are viewed through ideological discourse. However, a PTMF perspective might have led to her understanding her experiences from a very different perspective. For the purposes of illustrating how this might look from the framework perspective, I have looked at Astrid's story using the core PTMF questions. So what is happening to Astrid? How is power operating in her life? Well, there are legal requirements to send her daughter to school. And the economic and material power shows that while she had a materially privileged upbringing, but she's now faced with financial insecurities. There's interpersonal power, such as the dominance of health professionals in her life and criticism from her partner for working long hours. And biological power operates because she's exhausted. And coercive power means that she's exposing her daughter to large social groups. And ideological power is operating through the powerful combination of social and ideological expectations of being a competent nurse or health professional by playing a vital key role during the pandemic whilst coping with the overwhelming demands of the job. There's rigid gender stereotyping of being a dedicated frontline health professional, being a caring daughter, a good mother and life partner. On reflection, this shows that Astrid is facing a number of power imbalances in her daily life, of which she has little or no control over. These immediately challenge the medical narrative that might lead to Astrid being diagnosed with mental illness. It is important to note the social norms of and expectations associated with ideological power and how these also impact how a person views themselves. So what kind of threats might this pose? Well, in a relationship, there's rejection and invalidation, criticism from her partner, a reduced bond with her daughter. There's emotional threats because she's feeling overwhelmed, tearful and on edge. So what kind of threats might this pose? Well, there's threats in her relationships through rejection, invalidation, criticism from her partner, and a reduced bond with her daughter. There may also be emotional threats, such as feeling emotionally overwhelmed, tearful, and on edge. There may be threats in the community, such as initial privilege of being a health professional, but now loss of social role through restrictions and loss of long-term colleagues. Economic and material threats. Initially, she had a privileged life, but now is faced with financial insecurity. There are definitely environmental threats, such as being unsafe in all environments, work, home, and out in the public. There are bodily threats because she's physically exhausted. And there are threats to the values that she holds, to her identity and meaning making, because she's strongly encouraged to learn and live up to professional values throughout her life, with additional pressure associated with being a dedicated and hardworking health professional. These threats are implied by operation of power, and here we see the extent of the difficulties Astrid has to deal with. We can also see how the core PTMF questions overlap. It is clear how power becomes more endemic in terms of values and identity and meaning making, and how this can easily lead to becoming stressed, which also leads to becoming emotionally overwhelmed and physically exhausted. The framework then asks what sense a person is making from their experiences, or what is the meaning of those experiences. However, we can only confirm them by checking them out with the person themselves. Some meanings Astrid may have developed could be shame, failure, inadequacy, hopelessness, worthlessness, rejected, afraid, responsible, guilty, and powerlessness. However, on reflection, meaning is the central thread of the PTMF, but only Astrid herself would have been able to tell us if these feelings or meanings seem to fit. If we knew more about Astrid's life, additional meanings might emerge. And then we move on to asking, what is a person doing to survive, or what kind of threat responses are they using? So in Astrid's story, she was experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, panic, the urge to flee or escape. She was tearful, avoidance, overworking, in denial, and striving to live up to others' values. So what strengths might Astrid have? What access to power resources might she have? Well, she was family orientated, caring, artistic, dedicated and hardworking, friendly and sociable. She had a lot of concern for others' well-being, maybe goal-driven, committed, reliable, and dependable. And then we would move on to put Astrid's stories together. But it's important that you all learn to tell your stories, because everybody has a story to tell. And the framework is not an act of rebellion against powerful systems. It is about supporting one another to reflect on harmful narratives that are being imposed, and to liberate ourselves to define our own truths and reclaim authorship of our own narratives. This empowers everyone to rewrite their own stories so they can begin their healing journey. Thank you for your time.